In this video, we'll be creating a spoiler for a third-gen Mazda Miata using scan data, forms, and surfacing tools. Hey everyone, this is Matt with Learn Everything About Design, and in this video, we're going to create yet another spoiler. We're going to do it a little bit differently in this one. We're going to take a look at scan data. We're going to recreate part of the trunk that we're interested in with forms, and then we're going to use surfacing tools to create the rest of the body. So the way that we're going to approach this is first by inserting a scan. Now, this was provided to me from a subscriber, but I cannot share the scan data. So if you have your own scan data, you can follow along, or you can just watch to learn the process. So the first thing I'm going to do is insert a mesh. I need to find the mesh, and in this case, it's a trunk scan of an MX5, again, an NC or a third gen Mazda Miata. When we look at this, everything seems to be okay as soon as we insert it. But if we take a look at all the edges using Control and 6, you can also go to your display settings and make sure that your visual style is shaded with visible edges. You can see all of the little register marks that were placed on the trunk. This typically happens with the scanning process when you're trying to use it for scan alignment. Now, a lot of these scanners need to have alignment dots or some way to actually stitch the scans together. And if we look at this from the top, we can see exactly where those different scans were. You can see that there's a little piece that's right here. You can see this big triangular section here. You see a straight section. There's some lines here. And this tells me that this was scanned in probably 7 or 8 different orientations. And when we rotate it around, another thing that we can see if we hide the edges is sometimes you can see this ridge effect. Now, this typically happens when there are shadows or the scan is potentially at a pretty steep angle. So you can kind of see the back looks pretty good, and then what's happening is it's having a really hard time registering that data, and you can see the further away it gets, the worse that is. The good news for us is that we really only need to worry about this back edge. So the first step for me is to go into Direct Edit on the mesh and begin cleaning this up. The first thing that I want to do is reduce the brush size because I don't need to take such a big selection. And then I want to find the areas that I need to fix. So in my case, I'm going to use the brush tool and I want to take out just enough so that I have a clean boundary on the outside. So you might need to rotate this around a little bit and just see what you're working with. And once you're happy, we're going to use the Modify, Erase, and Fill tool. Now, for a scan like this, I like to use the smooth option because I don't really care if it's quads or triangles, and I don't really care too much about the mesh density. I really just want to take the surrounding faces and I want to create a smooth patch. So you can see that does a much better job than the original. Based on the resolution of the scan, because we have bumps and waves and things like that, it's never going to be perfect, but you can come back and you can clean it up a little bit. And we can try again using Erase and Fill. Again, using the smooth setting. There is no preview for this, so you just have to try. It really wants to see a complete closed selection, so leaving that center open didn't work. But if we just go through and we grab the areas we're interested in, again, Erase and Fill. And you need to do this in all the areas where you're concerned or you need to actually have something to attach to. It's not going to be a perfect solution. This is much better done in the scan software when you're aligning scans, but this is what we have to work with. You don't always have options. Sometimes you have to do this manually. So I'm going to go ahead and just process a few of these. So again, Erase and Fill, Smooth, and we'll just get rid of all the ones that we're interested in. For the spoiler that we're going to make, it's going to be a sort of a duck bill or a duck tail. I've heard them called different things before, but it's just going to stick to the back of the trunk lid. And it's going to have an integrated brake light. This is going to be done with LEDs. So we just want to make sure that we get enough of the trunk that we can create or replicate this with our forms tools. Depending on the amount of mesh elements you have, this process could take quite a bit. And again, it depends on how clean the scan was. The cleaner the scan, the better off you are. Another thing that you can do to help save time is just cut away anything that you don't need. The more mesh elements that we have here, the longer it's going to take for us to use it. So if we're creating form bodies or if we're doing anything with the mesh itself, the larger the mesh file is, the longer that process is going to take. So again, it's not perfect, but this gets us pretty close. So once we're happy with the results, you could try to remesh the entire thing by using the remesh option. It's going to get further and further away from an accurate scan, and because we have such highs and lows in various areas, it's really not going to be a good option in this case. So I'm just going to finish this knowing that I do have maybe a less than ideal mesh in certain areas. It's still going to be okay for what we're trying to do here. So again, you can cut away a lot of this if you don't need it. I'm just going to leave it for this example, and I'm going to move into the Forms workspace. Inside of Forms, the first thing that I want to do is use the Face tool. I'm going to enable object snapping, and I'm going to try to put an offset. I'm going to say that this is going to be 10 millimeters. The reason I want to use an offset is because this is going to allow me to begin to create the mesh sections and hopefully still see it above the mesh. It doesn't always work perfectly. You might need to enable the edges, so Control and 6 for me, so that way we can find out where these edges are. What we're going to do is we're going to build out the mesh shape, or the form face shape on the mesh. And then we'll go back and we'll reduce the mesh, or we'll reduce the face sizes by subdividing and moving things around. We're just trying to get relatively close to the shape for right now. So once we're happy with that, we'll say OK. I'm going to use Modify, Edit Form. I'm going to select the entire form body, and I'm just going to move it up. The last step of this process is going to be to push it back down to the actual mesh. So for right now, it doesn't actually need to be on the mesh, but using the Face tool with the Snap option makes it a little bit easier for us. So once we're happy with the location of this so we can work with it, I'm going to go into box display mode. That's Alt and 1. You can also go to your display options and select display mode box display. And then we're going to use modify edit form, use the all option, and I'm going to begin modifying the back edge. I'm going to get this close to where the shading starts to change. That's where the geometry starts to roll over. And I'm going to pull this back. The closer we get here, the more dangerous this becomes actually, because as we begin to automatically project down to the mesh, it could try to roll over the back edge. So you do have to be careful. Don't stick it way out here. In our case, I'm just getting relatively close, and I'm going to add an additional edge here to get the resolution a bit closer. Also think long and hard about how far out you want to go with this. And I'm not going to be using this back edge, but I do want to get it to be very similar in shape to this one here. And I'll show you why in just a second. So once we're happy with that, I'm going to double click on this back edge, and I'm going to go to Insert Edge. When we use Insert Edge, it's going to average the shape of this back edge and this edge here, and it's going to give us a nice clean division line. So I'm going to say OK, double click this edge, and just hit Delete on the keyboard. So this gives me a much cleaner starting point. Before I move any further, I want to sort of fix some of the divisions here. So I'm going to do that with Insert Point. I'm going to go from here straight up, hit Enter, and then delete that one. And I'm going to repeat that process. So what we want to do is go to Modify, Insert Point, and I'm going to try to make this one roughly vertical as well, and then get rid of this edge. It doesn't have to be completely vertical, but again, it's just going to help us a little bit. So I'm going to modify this one. I'm just going to manually pull this one over, and that looks pretty good. Next step for me is I'm going to go ahead and extrude this. So I'm going to hold down Alt on the keyboard, and I'm going to use the vertical arrow, in this case in the positive Y. And again, just pull it back to where we need. You can see the areas we patched, and we want to avoid any areas we didn't patch. So I'm only going to go back so far. That looks pretty good, so I'll say OK. And I want to subdivide this, and I also want to mirror it. And the main reason I want to mirror it is because I want to make sure that I'm directly in the middle. So we're going to go to Symmetry, Mirror Duplicate. The mirror plane will be the mid plane, which is exactly where the scan is centered. You can see by the Mazda emblem. And we're going to use the Weld option, but if the edges are not close enough, we're going to have to manually do that with Weld Vertices. It'll automatically pull them in together since we do have symmetry, so they will automatically go to the middle, and now we've got our symmetry line. Next, I want to go ahead and subdivide this, and I want to subdivide the entire thing, so I'm going to box select everything. Simple or exact aren't really going to matter in this case because exact is going to save or preserve the shape we have, but we're going to push the entire thing down to the mesh. So again, it doesn't really matter for us in this case. We'll say OK. And the last step for me, once I'm happy with the shape, is to use the pull tool. Now, pull will allow me to select vertices and push them down to a mesh. We need to be sure that we're using surface points because surface is going to be our smooth display and control points will be our box display. In this case, it would actually be pretty close with either one, but surface points is going to be the right selection for us. I'm going to box select every vertice and allow it to automatically push those down to the trunk. So we can see where they were originally at, the green dots, and you can see where they're at now. There's a little bit of wave in these edges. It's not really a big deal, but depending on the curvature you're working with, if you have something that has a lot of curvature, this is the time where you would want to subdivide it more potentially to get a little bit closer result. Before I exit, I'm going to hide this. I'm going to go into smooth display, which is Alt and 3, and just make sure that everything looks smooth. I think it looks pretty good. There's some waves in the back edge and the front edge. It's not going to be a problem because we're going to trim that up. So I'm going to finish the form and convert it to a surface. Now, you'll notice that we have one big surface here. So that's good for us because we don't have any face divisions. The next thing for me is to start to work with this as a surface. I want to bring back the mesh body just so I can see. You'll notice that it looks like it's a little bit high on this side and a little bit low on this side. That's okay as long as we're close to the shape. And as we rotate around, we shouldn't really see any drastic differences between the trunk and the shape. We should see the edge and it should be a perfect copy. So the next step for me is to create a sketch on the top. And what I want to do is I'm going to start with a line. I'm going to hide the mesh for now. I'm going to start with a vertical line, and this is just going to be a mirror reference for me. We'll hit escape to get off our line tool, and we'll turn that into a construction line. Next, I'm going to use the line tool again, and I'm going to make some horizontal lines. These are going to be perpendicular off of our vertical line. Again, escape to get off the line tool and convert both of these to construction. It can be done with X on the keyboard, or you can manually go over to the line type and change them to construction. The reason I wanted those is because instead of using something like a spline, I want to use a simple 3-point arc. So I can go from here, sort of pick where the spoiler needs to end, and use a nice arc for that. I'm going to do the same thing on the front edge, making sure that I have tangency here. So you want to make sure that you do carry that tangency across here. So that way when we mirror this, it's going to automatically be a smooth transition. You'll notice that a tangency was applied automatically over here. I'm going to select it and just delete it because I want these arcs to be inside of my surface. So I need to make sure I pull this up. And if you have trouble seeing this, oftentimes it can be hard if you've got a gray body and you've got these light blue lines. You can always go into a different visual style. So for example, wireframe will allow you to see just the border of that profile. And now we can see these arcs a little bit better. If we're concerned with the shape, we can always bring back the mesh as well. Keep in mind that it's a little tricky displaying all of these edges and these vertices, but you can kind of see that we're trying to follow the line of the trunk. It's going to get us pretty close, so I'm happy with that. The next thing I want to do is I want to connect these with a line. This doesn't necessarily have to be vertical, but we want to completely enclose that profile. If you know the shape of the spoiler from this view, this is also a good time to start trimming it. So for example, if you wanted it to sort of come up and in, then we could use our trim tool. And we can get rid of these other lines. And we can even apply fillets at this point if you want to. Sometimes it can be a little bit tricky to apply fillets now, but if you want to, you can. For me, I'm actually not going to. I'm going to hit escape. I'm going to do Control Z and undo on those. And the reason is because I want to use this back edge for a sweep profile, and I don't want to roll that sweep around the corner. I'm going to leave it sharp here. But again, it just depends on your intent, and you can always figure that out for your own shape. Before we exit our sketch, we want to make sure we mirror all of these. So we're going to take all the lines and arcs that we created. We're going to mirror those about that vertical reference line and say OK, and this should give us a closed profile now. I'm going to make sure that I go back to my shaded view, and then I'm going to finish the sketch. Now, when you're working with surfaces or solids, there are multiple ways that we could do this. We could extrude this, and we could do an extrude from an object and simply select this, and then we can create a thickened solid body directly off of that surface. That is one way to work, and it's a perfectly valid method. We're going to use the surfacing tools, so that means that I'm going to use trim. This is my trim tool, and you might need to hold down Control to make sure that you select both sides. And then we're going to trim away everything on the outside of that shape. I can hide the sketch, and now I've got the shape of the trunk lid in the size and shape of the spoiler that I want. So the next step for me is going to be to break this thing in half. Now, I only want to work on half of it because I know I have symmetry, so we're going to trim just one side of this, and it makes it easier for us to work. Next, we're going to create a sketch on our side view. In this case, it's right for me. We're going to go to Create, Project Include, and Intersect. You could also just simply project the midline because we did split this up with the plane. We know that it's going to be the same thing, but we want a reference here. So if I hide the body, you can see that it only grabbed that point. So that's going to be problematic. So we want to make sure that we do project the edge. So I'm going to use Create, Project Include, and Project, and make sure that I have that vertex and the edge. So the next thing that we want to do is we want to build out the back of the spoiler. I'm going to do this with a straight line, and we're going to blend things together later. We could do this with a spline or an arc, but just having a small little sort of fin there is going to be the method I go. I am going to add a vertical line here, hit Escape to get off the line tool, convert that to construction, and then D to add a degree here. I want that to go back at 35 degrees, and then I'm going to finish the sketch. Now we can use our sweep tool. This will be our profile, and we're going to use a single path. And you'll notice it gives us an error because it tries to grab the entire thing. We want to turn off chain selection and just use the back edge. We're going to do this as a new body. Sometimes with surfacing tools, you'll have a join option, like when you do a mirror. But in most of the cases, it'll be a new body, and it'll be up to you to use the stitch tool to put them together. I'm going to try to stitch these two together. And then I want to use Create and Thicken to turn it into a solid body. Select both, and let's see if we can get 5 millimeters. One thing you'll note is it creates a bunch of edges on the back. That might be problematic for us, but for right now, we don't really have a good option around that. I do want to note that we have some potential issues in this corner. And you can see that we're going to have to do some additional trimming to clean that up. If we went the other direction, it might be fine. Or if we apply a fillet, it might be okay. So I'm going to hit Cancel, and I'm going to try to fillet this corner first. So I'm going to go to Modify, Fillet, and I'm just going to put a radius in there. And you can see that it's giving me an error. There's a problem with this edge. It does not like to apply a fillet, which means that we could do it manually with something like a loft between the two. We could trim these away, or we could try to do it as a solid later. In the interest of time, let's go ahead and try the solid route. So we'll go to Thicken again. We're going to thicken this 5 millimeters. We'll say OK. And then we're going to clean up this corner here. Now, one of the benefits of Fusion 360 is oftentimes you can just select a face and hit Delete and allow it to try to patch. However, when you're in the surface workspace, all it's going to do is turn this into a surface body. So Control Z, if we go back to solids and we try to do the same thing on that face, if it's able to, it'll try to remove it and patch it, but you'll notice it doesn't turn it into a surface body. For our purposes, this is now a solid body, so we can work with it as a solid body, but I do want to clean up that edge. There are a couple different ways that we can do this. We can create a sketch and trim this away, or we can go to Split Body. The body to split will be this entire thing, and the splitting tool is just going to be this face. We're going to allow it to extend, and in some cases, you'll note that it will be able to clean this up and cut it. In this case, it's not working. So what that tells me is I need to create a sketch to cut this away. So for me, I'm going to do that on the top plane. And you can see that with the thicken, it went out normal to the curvature. So you can see that this edge here is actually further away than the bottom edge because of the way that it was thickened and the way that we had our curvature. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to take it from this point right here. So I'm going to hit P to convert that or project it. And then I'm going to just use my line tool. And I'm going to come just completely forward to hack off that corner. It doesn't have to be perfect, but we do want to make sure we extend it out through the body. And then we can use that as a split tool. So bodies to split, splitting tool. And now what we've done is we've removed that section from the body. We can right click and remove it from the browser. And now we have a clean corner. With the clean corner, we should be able to apply fillets now. And I'm going to start with the inside fillet. I'm going to try to add a 5mm fillet. We do have some options for tangency and curvature continuity. These tend to get a little finicky when we're dealing with complex surfaces like this. So for a case like this, I'm going to try to stick with just the default tangent. I'm going to see if we can increase this any more, 10mm, and say okay. Remembering that this is going to be a spoiler, you have to think about the wind load, and even though it's not very large, this is going to be the weak point. So if we had a sharp corner there, that would be what's called a stress riser, and that would eventually lead to fracture, especially if this thing is 3D printed. We're going to repeat the fillet. Noting that we have 5mm thickness, I'm going to try to do 15mm to keep a consistent wall thickness. So that's our inside radius, which is 10, plus the thickness of the material, 5, which will give me that nice consistency. We'll say okay there. And I'm going to try to fill it one more time. I do want to note that with the fillet tool, you can add additional selection sets. If they're dealing with different edges, then generally that works okay, but sometimes you have to be careful. This one's going to get tricky. If we go any further than this edge, it's going to fail. So we just need to pick something that visually looks okay. I'm going to hold down Control, and I'm going to select these two corners as well and apply the same fillet to those and say okay. Before we do anything with these edges, I do want to change the shape just a little bit. I want to give it a little bit of style, so I'm going to cut some of this out on the back. So again, another sketch. I want to think about the edge, this back edge here, and where I want to cut. So I want to cut up to this point right here, so I'm going to hit P to project that. And you can see that it actually brought in most of that edge. You can see where our sketch plane is. And then I want to think about how I want to connect that. So I'm going to use my line tool. I'm going to create a vertical line. I'm going to create a horizontal line out to the left and hit escape to get off my line tool. This will be construction. And then I'll use a spline to go from here to whatever point I want to connect to. Escape off the spline tool. This, we can simply add a horizontal constraint, or we could make it tangent to that reference line. This one over here is going to need a tangency or curvature continuity with whatever we want to connect to. So we're going to finish that sketch. This should be a complete closed profile. We should be able to select that. Since we're dealing with a solid body, we can just extrude this out. We want to go in both directions. I'm going to just say symmetric. And notice that it's not cutting everything out of the top. We're leaving a little bit of a sliver there. That's something that we should account for in our sketch. So if we hit cancel, edit our last sketch, we can do that with just some vertical lines because we want to cut straight through, and then just come back down to this point, making sure that this edge is vertical as well. And now we should have those two profiles that we can select, this one and this one here. So once again, we'll use extrude, and that should not leave any slivers on the top. We should have a clean cut. You'll notice that it is leaving a little bit on the inside. So that's interesting that it is leaving a little sliver there. We'll be able to deal with that in just a second. And you'll also note that the way we're cutting this is also leaving a little bit of a lip there. So we'll deal with that as well. One thing that we could do is we could trim this before it's thickened. But in this case, let's just see how we can work with this. So Fusion's actually pretty good with direct editing. So if I select this face and just hit delete, oftentimes it'll be able to remove it and patch it for us without any problems. So that looks pretty good. And then over here, we need to think about how we want this transition to be. So I'm going to start by selecting fillet, and I'm going to try to fillet this corner. It should let us go pretty large. Looks like about 8.5 millimeters is going to be the limit. So I'm going to just say 8 millimeters. And what this is going to allow me to do, it's going to allow me to fill this upper edge, which should carry all the way around, and then we can blend these into it as well. So I'm going to start with this upper edge, which carries all the way around the body, and I'm going to try a 2 millimeter fillet. Remember that the entire thickness is 5 millimeters, so I'm going to say OK to that, right click and repeat it, and now I'm going to try to fillet this edge here that wraps around. And I'm going to try 2 millimeters. You can see that it doesn't like this transition in the corner. Sometimes we can get away with a smaller fillet. If you absolutely have problems here, then the way to get around this is for us to manually blend this together. So if I try to do a fillet just here at 2 millimeters, you can see that it's failing in the corner. And if we try to do it here, again, it's going to fail. So if you run into a situation like this and you want to manually blend this, we can go back to our surface tools. We can select this face and this one and simply delete them, which will turn this into a surface body. And now we can work on these surfaces and blend them together manually. A couple different ways that we could do this. One, we could try the patch tool. Generally, the patch tool, if we try to connect all the edges and add tangency, this has a good chance of failing just because of the change in curvature. So probably a better way for us to do this is to loft from this front edge to this back edge. We're going to apply tangency to each of those. And you can see this is giving me a little bit of a raised lip. If we view it from the side, you can see that it's keeping the tangency here and it's blending it. And if I'm happy with that shape, I can just simply say OK. And then what I can do is I can stitch these together. And then I can try to just patch that. Now, if we want to use tangency here, we're going to actually have to do a little bit more work. But you can see that it's actually not allowing it to fill. So the way that we get around that, again, is by using our loft tool. I'm going to loft from this edge to this fillet. I'm going to allow it to have tangency. I'm going to change these free edges to surface aligned. And that doesn't look very good. I don't like what's happening in this corner. And that's because it looks like this is actually flipped. You can see that it looks like it's twisted. So I'm going to reselect Profile 2. And again, I'm going to try tangency. And as soon as we try to apply that tangency, it begins to flip. Because this is a very minor transition, we could simply get away with making them connected. Or we could do a little bit more work to sort of clean this up. It really is going to depend on your end goal. If you want to clean this up more, then the way that we have to do it is by splitting some faces. So because this face is raised up, what we're going to end up doing is creating a sketch. We're going to use our project tool, which is P on the keyboard. I'm going to project all of these edges just so I have them as references. You can see there's a little edge here that we want to grab. I'm going to rotate this slightly and grab this edge as well. Once I have those edges as a reference, let's go ahead and bring it back in view. What I want to do is I'm going to create an arc from here and just carry it over with tangency. Again, this can be hard to see, so visually we can go back to a wireframe view. And I'm going to do the same thing down here. Just going to create an arc. And actually on the back side, I take that back. I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to project this edge right here. And I'll project this one as well. But this arc over here, we're going to have tangency. And what we want to do here is we're going to just sort of trim out these surfaces. So I'm just going to do this with a line. I'm going to figure out a position that makes sense once I can get all of this rounded section away. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to create either a split face or some sort of way to trim this away. We can't use the trim tool, unfortunately, because it'll hack away more than we want. But if we use the split face tool, we can pick individual faces that we want to split. So that looks good. And then we can pick the splitting tool. Now, in our case, this is going to be the splitting tool. It's going to go all the way down to that edge we created. So the main thing that we want to make sure is that we have these two new edges. Once we split them, we can come in and use the delete key. Just select them and delete them. So sometimes pushing those back a bit can help us get into maybe a better scenario where it can actually blend this. So I'm going to try again to do tangency on everything. You can see that it has trouble in this corner. It does not like tangency in that corner, but some of the other areas seem to work okay. So if that's the case, again, we can go and we can try loft. I'm going to loft from here, and I want to use this edge and this edge. And we can try to loft to this edge, and we'll use the sides as guides. So we'll need to make sure that we grab everything as a guide. It will have to make sure that it connects. It tells us that the rail is not smooth, so it doesn't like that one. But on this side, we can use this as a rail. We should be able to apply tangency here. We should be able to apply tangency here. We should be able to apply tangency here. So this gets us much closer. It didn't allow us to select that edge, but the way that we get around that is by stitching them together and making sure our stitch tolerance includes that edge. So once those two are stitched together, Fusion will do a decent job of patching up the holes. So it's not a perfect solution. We could obviously go back to the drawing board a little bit and think about it a bit more. But the other thing I want to do is I can either patch this, or another option that we have, since we are in surfacing tools right now, is we can select these faces and delete them. And then we can just go ahead and mirror this as a surface. So we want to mirror the body, mirror across that midplane. And now we have the join option. And the join option here with this tolerance value, anything that's within 0.1 millimeters will be able to be stitched together. So you should see that in the left-hand side in the browser, we should end up with a solid body. So you can see now we've got sort of that smooth transition in the middle. We had to do a lot of work to make this happen. Again, we could have trimmed it before we did the thicken, and it probably would have been less of a headache, but it's a good way to sort of get us started. The last bit to this really comes down to the details. So this right now would be able to adhere with something like a double-sided tape. Typically when this is done, what you see is there'll be little recesses for tape to go in. Otherwise, it's going to raise it up the thickness of the tape. So if you're using something like a 3M VHB tape, which is typically what's used for stick-on body kits. So if you go back to like the early 2000s and you look at something like an Escalade that had stick-on fender flares and trim pieces, those were all done with double-sided tape. It's not typically the way things are done now, but it's very strong tape and it will hold up. So if that's what you need, then you can create a sketch. Remember that we already have a sketch that we used to trim that surface. So we can use that sketch to our advantage, and we can simply project and offset one of these edges. So I'm going to hit P, and I'm going to project these back edges. I'm going to offset them. And one thing that you have to know about offset is we can't offset an offset. So once we decide that we want to offset a curve, if I come to offset and I try to select this, it won't let me do it. But I can take this one here, and instead of going -20, if I know that I've got a strip of tape that's, let's say, 10 millimeters wide, I can just go to -30, and then I can figure out where I want that gap at. So for me, I want this to go all the way to the end, so I'm just going to cap off the ends. We'll finish the sketch, bring back the body, and hide that original sketch. And if this overlaps the corner, then you do want to be extremely careful. You might want to go in and edit this. And since we are dealing with solids and we're dealing with just closed profiles, we don't actually have to worry about the extra over here. We can just divide this up to make sure that we have a closed profile. So now that we have that closed profile, what we can do is we can take that. We can go to our solid extrude tools. And what I'm going to do is I am going to start from an object, or you can simply extrude up to an object. If you're completely below this, you can go to an object. We can select the solid body. And you'll note by default it's trying to join. So I'm going to use this offset value of 2 millimeters. Actually, it's going to have to be negative based on our orientation. and it's going to cut in a complete match of that shape. So this allows us to create that slight recess. Let's say that the tape was 5 millimeters thick, which is, it's not, it's very thin. But this allows us to have that slight recess so that the part will sit flush. And you can always go back and edit these. So instead of 2 millimeters, minus 0.5 is probably a little bit more realistic. But one thing you have to note, if you're using an object selection instead of something like a surface or a face, then it might be offsetting from this side here. So what we need to do in this case is say minus 4.5, and that'll give us that 0.5 millimeter gap. Let's go ahead and zoom out a little bit. And you would use that same process. So again, in this one, I told you that it was going to have an LED taillight. You would use that same process to just trim out where you wanted the taillight on the back. You have to think about running wires and doing all sorts of different stuff, but that's the way that you would do it. Now, the last bit for this would be to think about how you're going to manufacture it. And that's actually a pretty tricky one. So if you're going to try to manufacture something like this with fiberglass or carbon fiber, and you're trying to do it by hand, it's going to get pretty tricky. But essentially what you would do is you would create, you'd have to create a mold. And if you want to 3D print that, a couple ways that you could do this is to sort of create a block around this and then split it out. But then that's a lot of stuff to 3D print. So in reality, probably a more simple way would be to create some cross sections and print small sections of this and use it in like a lost wax or something like that. But it kind of is going to depend on your manufacturing process. So if that's something you're interested in, I can do some additional videos on trying to make a mold for this. But at this point, we've already gone over 35 minutes, and I don't want to take up any more time on this design. So again, we've already done several different spoilers. This was a slightly different approach because we took a scan, which we've done in the past. We replicated the top surface of the trunk using forms, and then we used that form as a surface to start building out the spoiler. Now, again, it could have been done as a solid or a surface body. Either would have been fine. The surface is still in here. We could have trimmed that back piece instead of having to deal with all of the issues of blending these together. But again, it's always important that you understand the tools at your disposal so you can pivot quickly and make design decisions. Anytime you're making a design like this, it's not going to be something that is parametrically controlled and easy to update. So spending a bunch of time dimensioning everything and trying to build it so that you can just tweak some values is probably not going to be realistic. We could go back to the sketch where we had 35 degrees and likely change that and adjust this. If I show this sketch and I show the dimensions, there is a slim possibility that I could modify this to say 30 degrees and have it all update. Chances are slim once we start tweaking things so that we have surface blends. You can see here it ends up failing. So as I said, it's usually not going to be as critical that you build something based off of dimensions because it's not going to be very easy to update something like this, especially when we factor in the scan data, the form bodies, and the surfaces. But if you have any questions on this, or if you'd like to see more of this with different cars, then please let me know. I've covered the spoiler angle a couple different times. We did it completely as a form body. We now did it with forms and surfaces, and I've also talked a little bit about meshes. And there are a couple there's a little bit more in terms of tips and tricks that we can get into, but this is the complete process for this workflow. So again, any questions, please let me know. As always, thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.